Hello, I'm Chris Anderson and I'll be your teacher today. Do you ever think about how your life could have been different? Do you think about the decisions you made when you were younger and how these decisions could have affected your life a little bit after that? Think about historic events. Would the world be a different place if events had been different? So far we're talking about hypothetical situations in the past and how they influence each other in the past. To explain this properly in English, we use what's called the third conditional. So far in these lessons we've looked at 0, first, second. Now we're looking at the third. The third is similar to the second in that it describes hypothetical situations. But unlike the second conditional, which is talking about imaginary situations in the present, the third conditional describes the past. So let's have a look at it. First of all, if plus had plus past participle, that is the third form of the verb, then we use would, could, might. Now let's remember here, would is completely imaginary, could to talk about possibility, and might 50-50 or uncertainty. And you'll see here in the third conditional we use would, could or might with have and the past participle, that is the third verb. So really what we're talking about here is imaginary, possible, uncertain situations in the past. Now you'll remember that conditional sentences come in two parts. So here we're talking hypothetical past and the consequences in the second half of the sentence. For example, if I had worked harder at school, I could have become a surgeon. So here, two events in the past, one after the other. In this case, somebody is talking about how they didn't work very hard at school, and so they didn't become a surgeon. But if they had, there would have been the possibility of them becoming a surgeon. So none of this information is technically true. In fact, it's sort of almost an alternate reality to what has happened in this person's life. In the same way, if she hadn't met him, she wouldn't have married him. So here, when we use the negative, what we're actually saying is she did meet him. But if she hadn't, what would have happened? Well, she wouldn't have married him. So really what we're saying is a mirror image to reality. She did meet this man, and so then she did marry him. He might have kept the dog if he had liked the dog. So here, as usual with the conditional sentences, we can swap the halves, we lose the comma, the meaning is more or less the same, more emphasis on the first half of the sentence here, have kept the dog, for example. And what we're saying here is it is uncertain that he would have kept the dog if he had liked the dog. So really, again, thinking about an alternative reality, he didn't like the dog, so he didn't keep him. So far, we've looked at how we can use the third conditional to describe personal histories, how our lives could, would, or might have been different if we'd made or done different things or made different decisions. We also use the third conditional to talk about world history, how the past could have been different if things had changed or things had not worked out the way that they did. So, for example, the structure is exactly the same if with the past perfect, had plus the third form of the verb, would, could, might plus have, meaning imaginary situation in the past possibility, or past uncertainty with might have. And not forgetting that we finish the sentences with the third form of the verb as well. For example, if he hadn't been killed, the world would have been a very different place. So again, we've got two events in the past and how one affects the other. In this case, he was killed, and so the world did become a different place. But we're talking about how things would have been different. Capitalism might not have become so popular if the American dream had failed. So again, when we use negatives, what we're talking about is an alternative. Capitalism did become popular. Why? Because you could argue the American dream didn't fail. You'll notice here as well the familiar pattern when we swap halves of sentences with the conditionals, the comma is lost and the emphasis is on this half of the sentence this time. If Americans hadn't walked on the moon first, Russians could have done. So here we're talking about the possibility in the past. And again, we've used the negative to emphasize how something did happen. So Americans did walk on the moon first. But if they hadn't, well, Russians could have done. It's a possible alternative to history. It's important to remember when you're producing third conditional sentences to use contractions. For example, you wouldn't really say have not, haven't. Would not have, no, not really. You would say wouldn't have. It can be useful for you when you're speaking because, to be honest, with third conditional sentences, there is a lot to remember. So far we've seen then that third conditional sentences describe an alternative to the past and how the consequences could or might or would have happened. This function is also evident when we use third conditionals in questions. For example, what would you have done if the bus hadn't arrived? So again, somebody did catch the bus did arrive, but we're asking somebody, what would you have done afterwards if the bus hadn't come? So again, as with all conditional sentences, it's very important to remember the change in word order when we're producing questions. What country might you have visited if you had had more money? A strange thing about English, we can use had together in the past perfect. In this case, we're talking about the uncertainty. There was a 50-50 chance. If this person had had more money in the past, what might they have done? If you hadn't learned how to drive, how could you have got there? So again, possibility in the past, this person did learn how to drive, but if they hadn't, what could they have done instead? If your dog had eaten it, would you have called a doctor or vet? So again, the dog didn't do this, so we didn't call the doctor or the vet, but if the dog had, what would we have done? So far we've looked at the third conditional in contrast to the other conditionals, 0, first and second. We've looked at how we can use the third conditional to talk about our own personal histories and the consequences in terms of would have, could have, or might have. Then we talked about how the third conditional can be used to talk about the history of the world and how the world's history could have, would have, or might have been different. Then we looked at question forms and how we ask questions in the third conditional connected to alternative versions of the past or hypothetical situations in the past and the consequences connected to them. So now, to check that you've understood this grammar point, you can take the exercises that follow this lesson. Good luck.